The royal decree burned in Adelheid's trembling hands as smoke filled the barn, and she had exactly 3 minutes to decide which would kill her faster: the Alpha King's blood oath demanding her son's execution, or the flames crawling up the wooden walls where she'd hidden the forbidden bloodline that could destroy 2 kingdoms. The child whimpered in the hay bale behind her, and she didn't see the shadow in the doorway, didn't see the rogue wolf whose silver eyes were locked on the infant who had his exact same birthmark, didn't know that the monster she'd been running from for 3 years was watching her choose between fire and family. Before we go further into this impossible choice, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because you're going to need it for what comes next. 3 years earlier, Adelheid Brunner had made the mistake every Omega warns their daughters about. She'd trusted an Alpha who wore kindness like a mask. His name was Ulrich, and he'd appeared in her village of Schwanden on a winter night when the pack law stated that all unmated wolves must present themselves to the Alpha King's council before the new moon. He'd told her he was a trader from the Northern Territories, that his wolf was weak, barely there, that he'd been rejected by his pack for his gentle nature. He'd courted her with wildflowers and honesty, or what she'd believed was honesty, and when he'd marked her under the eclipse, she'd thought she'd found the one wolf in all the territories who could love an Omega without trying to own her. She'd been wrong about everything except the child. The morning after their mating bond snapped into place, Adelheid had woken to an empty bed and a village on fire. Not literal flames, not yet, but the kind of fire that spreads through whispered words and pointed fingers. The Alpha King's guards had torn through Schwanden like a plague, their questions sharp as blades. Had anyone seen a rogue Alpha? Had anyone sheltered an enemy of the crown? Had anyone committed treason against pack law by harboring the banished heir to the Gotthard throne? That's when Adelheid learned the truth that would reshape her entire existence. The gentle trader named Ulrich was actually Ulrich von Gotthard, firstborn son of the rival Alpha King, the wolf who'd been declared dead 7 years ago after refusing a blood oath that would have bound him to slaughter an innocent pack. He hadn't died. He'd run. And he'd hidden in plain sight until the night he'd made the fatal mistake of marking an Omega who could give him an heir. The heir that pack law demanded must never exist. The heir that would unite 2 bloodlines that had warred for 3 centuries. The heir that the Alpha King's royal decree stated must be destroyed before his first breath. Adelheid had felt the child quickening in her womb the same day the guards had shown her the decree. The parchment was signed in blood by both Alpha Kings, hers and Ulrich's father, a rare moment of unity between eternal enemies. The message was clear. Any offspring of Ulrich von Gotthard and any wolf of the Brunner pack would be considered an abomination under pack law, a forbidden bloodline that threatened the delicate balance that kept the territories from all-out war. The child would be hunted. The mother would be executed. The father was already condemned. She'd run that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small, impossible flutter of life beneath her heart. She'd crossed 3 territories in 4 days. Had begged sanctuary from packs who'd turned her away the moment they'd scented the Gotthard bloodline in her womb. She'd learned quickly that when you carry a child that 2 kingdoms want dead, there's nowhere safe to hide. No pack that will risk the wrath of 2 Alpha Kings, no mercy in a world governed by blood oaths and ancient grudges. So she'd stopped running to packs and started running to shadows. The child was born in a cave during a thunderstorm that the old wolves would later say was an omen. Adelheid had bitten through a leather strap to keep from screaming, had delivered her son alone with only the lightning to see by, had held him to her chest as thunder shook the mountain and wondered how long she could keep him alive in a world that had declared him dead before he was born. He'd opened his eyes, silver like his father's, and in that moment she'd understood what it meant to love something more than your own life, to feel a bond so fierce that death became preferable to surrender. She'd named him Caspar, after her grandfather who'd fought in the last territory war. Caspar Brunner, not Caspar von Gotthard, because if the Alpha Kings discovered his father's name attached to him, he wouldn't survive the week. For 3 years she'd kept him hidden. She'd moved from village to village, never staying longer than a season, never letting him shift where other wolves could sense his bloodline, never allowing him to play with other children who might notice that his strength was too great, his senses too sharp, his very existence too impossible. She'd worked as a healer, a seamstress, a farmhand, anything that kept her beneath notice, anything that let her disappear into the ordinary lives of ordinary wolves who didn't question the quiet Omega with the too serious child who never laughed. Caspar had asked her once on his 3rd birthday why they couldn't stay in one place. Why they couldn't have a home. Why the other children had fathers and he had only stories. She'd told him the truth in the only way a mother can tell a child that the world wants him erased. Because you're special, little wolf. Because you're worth running for. The royal decree had found her in Erstfeld, a farming community so remote that she'd believed, foolishly, that they might finally be safe. She'd let her guard down. She'd let Caspar play in the fields. She'd let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, they could stop running. And that's when the Alpha King's messenger had arrived with a parchment that proved there was no corner of the territories where a blood oath couldn't reach. The decree was worse than before. The Alpha Kings had made a new pact, had offered a reward that would make any wolf rich beyond imagination. Whoever delivered the forbidden bloodline to the throne would be granted land, title, and a seat on the High Council. The hunt had evolved from execution to sport, from justice to entertainment. Every rogue wolf, every ambitious beta, every desperate Omega who needed to climb the pack hierarchy now had a reason to find Caspar and drag him to his death. Adelheid had run again, but this time the wolves had followed. She'd felt them tracking her through the forest, had heard their howls getting closer, had known with the terrible certainty that comes from maternal instinct that this was the chase that would end her. She'd reached the abandoned barn on the outskirts of a nameless village as the sun set, had hidden Caspar in a hay bale, had whispered promises she knew she couldn't keep. That's when she'd smelled the smoke. Someone had set the barn on fire. The hunters who'd tracked her had decided that if they couldn't claim the reward, no one would. The flames had started small, just a spark in the corner where old straw met older wood, but they'd grown fast, hungry, eating through the structure like a living thing. Adelheid had seconds to make an impossible choice. Run with Caspar into the waiting hunters, or stay and burn together, or... The third option crystallized in her mind with the clarity of absolute desperation. She could surrender herself. She could walk out with her hands raised, could let them take her, could give Caspar just enough time to stay hidden until the fire died, until the hunters left, until he could run somewhere, anywhere without her. The royal decree that had condemned him might save him if she played this exactly right. She'd kissed Caspar's forehead, had made him promise to stay silent no matter what he heard, had told him that someone would come for him, had lied to her child one final time because what else could a dying mother give except false hope? Then she'd walked toward the barn door, toward the flames and the hunters and the end of everything, when she'd heard the voice that stopped her heart. Step back from the door, Omega. The voice came from the shadows near the burning wall, deep and rough like gravel, like thunder, like every nightmare she'd had for 3 years compressed into 2 words. Adelheid had spun, had seen the silhouette of a massive wolf in human form, had seen silver eyes reflecting the firelight, had known before her rational mind could catch up that this was death in a shape she recognized. The rogue Alpha stepped into the light, and her world tilted sideways. It was Ulrich. Older, scarred, with a hardness in his face that hadn't been there 3 years ago, but unmistakably him. The father of her child. The heir who'd been declared dead. The Alpha who'd abandoned her to a war she'd never chosen. You, she'd breathed, and the word held 3 years of rage and grief and betrayal. You did this. I saved you, he'd said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd convinced himself that destruction was mercy. The hunters were minutes away. The fire will cover your escape. My escape. The laugh that tore from her throat was sharp enough to cut. I have nowhere to go, Ulrich. I've been running for 3 years because of you. Because you marked me. Because you gave me. She'd stopped, but they both knew how the sentence ended. Because you gave me a child that the world wants to destroy. His eyes had gone to the hay bales, had fixed on the spot where Caspar was hidden with the precision of a wolf who could scent his own blood. Where is he? No. The word was a growl, her Omega wolf rising to the surface for the first time since she'd fled Schwanden. You don't get to ask that. You don't get to know him. You're dead, remember. That's what the Alpha Kings declared. So stay dead. Ulrich had moved faster than she could track, had crossed the burning barn in 3 strides, had pulled her back from a falling beam that would have crushed her skull. They'd stood there, her wrist in his grip, the fire raging around them, and she'd seen something flicker across his face that looked almost like pain. "I watched you," he'd said quietly. "For 3 years I've tracked you across every territory. I've killed the hunters who got too close. I've sent false trails to the Alpha Kings. I've done everything I could to keep you both alive without revealing that I'm still breathing. And you think I abandoned you?" The words had hit her like a physical blow. You've been following us? Every village, every cave, every desperate escape in the middle of the night. I've been the shadow you never saw, the rogue wolf in the distance, the reason you made it this far. His grip had tightened, not painfully, but with the desperate pressure of a wolf who'd been holding on by a thread. "I couldn't approach you. If the Alpha Kings knew I was alive, if they knew I'd found you, they'd send armies instead of hunters. My death is the only thing keeping Casper safe." Adelheid had stared at him, this ghost who'd been haunting her without her knowledge, and felt something crack in her chest. "You know his name. I've known everything. I heard you name him in the cave. I've watched him grow." Ulrich's voice had broken on the last word. "I've seen him laugh, though you're right that he doesn't do it often. I've watched you teach him to be gentle when his bloodline wants him to be brutal. I've seen you raise our son alone, and The roof had chosen that moment to collapse, had sent a shower of embers down on them both. Ulrich had shoved Adelheid behind him, had taken the burning debris across his back, had turned to her with eyes that held 3 years of suppressed agony. "I need you to listen to me," he'd said, and his voice carried the command of an alpha who'd been born to rule kingdoms. "The hunters outside aren't random rogues. They're council agents. The Alpha Kings have escalated this from a hunt to a political purge. They're not just looking for Casper anymore. They're looking for any wolf who's helped you, any pack that's given you shelter, any thread that connects to the forbidden bloodline. This isn't about pack law anymore. This is about erasing a mistake that threatens their power." "What are you saying?" But she'd already known. The horror was there in his face, in the way his hands had started to shake. "I'm saying that the council has issued a new decree. Any Omega bearing the mark of a Gotthard heir must face trial. Any child born of a forbidden bloodline must be presented to the throne before the next full moon." His eyes had gone to the hay bales again. "They're not hunting Casper to kill him anymore, Adelheid. They're hunting him to control him. Because a child with both Gotthard and Brunner blood could unite the territories, could end the war, could overthrow both Alpha Kings and everything they've built." The realization had crashed over her like ice water. They want to use him. They want to raise him as a weapon. A puppet king who'll do whatever they command because he'll have no choice, no knowledge of who he really is, no memory of the mother who died to protect him. Adelheid had looked at the fire, at Ulrich, at the hay bales where her son was hiding, and made a decision that would alter 3 lives irrevocably. "Then we don't let them take him." "How?" "We're surrounded. The barn is burning. Even if we fight our way out, there are 12 agents and 2 of us." "No." She'd stepped back, had let her Omega wolf surface fully, had felt the power that she'd been suppressing for 3 years flood through her veins. "There's one thing they don't know. One secret I've kept even from you." Ulrich had gone very still. "What secret?" "I'm not just an Omega, Ulrich. My grandmother was a seer. The gift skipped my mother, but it didn't skip me. I've been having visions since Casper was born, and every single one shows the same thing. He survives this night. We don't." The words hung in the burning air between them, terrible and certain. "No," Ulrich had said, but it was the denial of a wolf who already knew the truth. "No, there has to be another way. I didn't watch you for 3 years just to let you die now." "You didn't watch us," Adelheid had corrected gently. "You protected us. And now you're going to protect him one more time." She'd moved to the hay bales, had pulled Casper out. The child was shaking but silent, his silver eyes wide, and had placed him in Ulrich's arms. "This is your father, little wolf. I need you to go with him." Casper had looked between them with the terrible understanding that children have when adults stop pretending everything will be fine. "Mama, I love you," she'd whispered and kissed his forehead one last time. "I love you more than breath, more than life, more than every star in the sky. And I need you to remember that when they tell you who you are, when they try to make you into something you're not, when you forget my face." She'd turned to Ulrich, had seen the Alpha Heir's composure cracking. "There's a passage in the eastern wall. It leads to the river. Take him. Run. Don't stop until you reach the disputed territories. Adelheid. They'll follow the mother, not the rogue. They'll see me try to escape and they'll chase, and you'll have the window you need." Her voice had hardened into something that could cut diamonds. "But you need to give me something first. You need to break the mating bond." The words had hit him like a blade. "What? If I die with the bond intact, it'll kill you too. And Casper needs his father, even if you can't tell him that's who you are. Even if you have to be the rogue guardian, the mysterious protector, the shadow he never quite sees." She'd grabbed his face, had forced him to meet her eyes. "Break it. Before I lose my courage." What happened next would be retold in whispers among the wolf packs for generations. The moment an Alpha Heir and an Omega chose their child over their bond, over their love, over everything except survival. Ulrich had placed Casper down gently, had taken Adelheid's hands, had let his alpha power surge through the connection that had defined them both for 3 years. Breaking a mating bond is like severing a limb. It's violent, agonizing, leaves scars that never heal. Adelheid had felt it tear through her chest, had felt the golden thread that connected her to Ulrich snap like a breaking bone, had collapsed to her knees as her wolf howled in anguish. Ulrich had fared no better. He'd staggered, had caught himself on the burning wall, had looked at her with eyes that held the kind of devastation that has no name. "I will keep him safe," he'd rasped. "I swear on my father's throne, on my rejected crown, on everything I've ever been or will be, I will keep our son alive." "I know." She'd smiled through tears. "I've seen it. In every vision he grows up strong, loved, free." She'd glanced at the door, at the shadows moving outside. "They're coming. Go." Ulrich had gathered Casper. The child was crying now, reaching for his mother, and moved toward the eastern wall. He'd paused at the hidden passage, had looked back one last time at the Omega who'd given him everything. "Adelheid Brunner," he'd said, and his voice carried the weight of an alpha blessing. "Your name will be remembered when the Alpha Kings are dust. Our son will know what you sacrificed. This is not the end of your story." Then he'd disappeared into the darkness with Casper's cries echoing behind him. Adelheid had stood in the burning barn for exactly 3 seconds after they'd left. 3 seconds to memorize the sound of her son's voice. 3 seconds to let herself feel the empty space where the mating bond had been. 3 seconds to transform from a mother into a warrior. Then she'd shifted. Her Omega wolf was smaller than an alpha's, faster than a beta's, but she'd learned in 3 years of running that size meant nothing when desperation gave you wings. She'd burst through the barn door in full wolf form, had seen the council agents waiting in a semicircle, had seen their momentary confusion when they realized she was alone. "The child!" one of them had shouted. "Where's the forbidden bloodline?" Adelheid had answered by lunging at the nearest agent, teeth bared, every instinct screaming at her to buy Ulrich more time. The fight had been brutal, quick, and entirely unfair. 12 trained council wolves against 1 Omega who'd spent 3 years hiding instead of fighting. But she'd been fighting for something they couldn't understand. Not her life, but the seconds that her life could purchase. She'd taken down 2 before they'd pinned her. She'd scarred 3 more before they'd forced her shift. And when they'd finally gotten her in chains, when the lead agent had demanded to know where she'd hidden the child, she'd laughed. "Gone," she'd said, tasting blood. "Beyond your reach. Beyond the Alpha Kings. Beyond the royal decree and the blood oath and every law you've used to justify murder." The lead agent had struck her hard enough to crack bone. "We'll find him. We'll track him. And when we do, we'll make sure he watches what we do to traitors like you." "You'll try." Adelheid had smiled through broken teeth. But you won't succeed. Because while you've been hunting a child, you've forgotten something important about forbidden bloodlines. They're forbidden because they're powerful. And my son. He's more powerful than either Alpha King will ever be. That's when they'd brought out the royal decree. The new one. The one that hadn't existed when she'd fled Erstfeld, but that had been issued in the hour since the barn fire started. The Alpha Kings had escalated again, had made a declaration that sent ice through her veins. Any Omega who refused to surrender a forbidden bloodline would face trial by the High Council, and the sentence would be carried out publicly as a warning to any wolf who might harbor similar treason. The trial would be held in 3 days, in the neutral territory between kingdoms, where both Alpha Kings could watch her die. They'd dragged her to the council grounds in chains, had paraded her through 12 territories as an example of what happened when wolves defied pack law. Adelheid had kept her head high through all of it, had refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, had held on to the knowledge that somewhere out there, Ulrich had Caspar safe. But on the second day of the journey she'd felt it, the faint, ghostly echo of a mating bond that shouldn't exist anymore. It was impossible. Ulrich had broken the connection. She'd felt it snap. But there it was, a whisper of sensation that told her he was close, that he was following, that the rogue Alpha who'd been declared dead was stalking the council caravan like a shadow. He was going to try to save her. He was going to get himself killed. She'd tried to send a message through the broken bond, tried to tell him to run, to take Caspar far away and never look back. But the bond was too fractured, the connection too weak. All she could do was hope that the Alpha who'd spent 3 years protecting them from a distance would understand that some sacrifices couldn't be undone. The trial had been exactly what she'd expected, a performance designed to instill fear. The High Council had assembled under an open sky, with both Alpha Kings seated on elevated thrones, with hundreds of wolves gathered to witness justice. The charges had been read with all the ceremony that made cruelty seem civilized. Treason against pack law, harboring a forbidden bloodline, defying a royal decree, resisting council agents. The sentence had been read with even more ceremony. Death by execution to be carried out at sunset, with the body burned and the ashes scattered so that no trace of her would remain. Adelheid had stood before the council with her hands bound and her wolf suppressed by silver chains, and she'd looked directly at the Alpha Kings as they'd asked for her final words. "I regret nothing," she'd said, and her voice had carried across the assembled wolves like a bell. "I loved a male who chose compassion over cruelty. I bore a child who will reshape your kingdoms. I ran for 3 years to protect a life that your laws declared forfeit before his first breath. And I would do it all again, knowing how it ends, because some things are worth more than survival. Some loves are worth dying for." The Alpha King of her territory, the one who'd signed the decree that condemned her, had leaned forward on his throne. "You speak of love, Omega. But what of duty? What of pack law? What of the blood oath that keeps our territories from tearing each other apart?" "Your blood oath," Adelheid had said quietly, "is built on the bodies of children who never got to choose their own fate. Your pack law is designed to keep alphas in power and omegas beneath notice. And your territories are already tearing each other apart, one execution at a time. My son's existence threatens you because he represents something you've spent centuries trying to destroy: unity. The possibility that wolves can be more than their bloodlines." The second Alpha King, Ulrich's father, the ruler of the Gotthard territories, had spoken then, and his voice held something that might have been regret. "The Omega speaks truth. But truth does not override 3 centuries of law. The sentence stands." They'd brought out the executioner as the sun touched the horizon. That's when the first howl split the air. It came from the western ridge, long and haunting and unmistakably Alpha. The assembled wolves had shifted uneasily, had scented the wind, had realized with dawning horror that the howl came from a bloodline they all recognized. Gotthard. Live. Ulrich had emerged from the tree line in full Alpha form, massive and scarred and radiating power that made even the council guards step back. He'd shifted to human form as he'd approached the council grounds, had walked naked and unashamed through the crowd of wolves who'd believed him dead for 7 years. Father, he'd said, and his voice carried across the stunned silence. I invoke the right of challenge. By pack law, any alpha may claim trial by combat to defend another's honor. I challenge this execution. The Alpha King of the Gotthard territories had gone white. You're dead. I was declared dead. There's a difference. Ulrich had stopped 10 paces from the throne. Had met his father's eyes with the steady gaze of a wolf who'd spent years preparing for this moment. You signed a blood oath saying any child of mine must be destroyed. You declared me dead when I refused to slaughter innocents. You've spent 7 years trying to erase the fact that you have a son who believes in mercy. But I'm still here, Father. And I'm still your heir. The other Alpha King had risen from his throne, hand on his sword. The forbidden bloodline. Where is it? Safe. Ulrich had smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Adelheid had ever seen. Beyond your reach. Beyond your laws. In a place where a child can grow up without being hunted for the crime of existing. You admit to harboring the offspring. The council's head jurist had stepped forward, had pulled out another decree. Then you are also guilty of treason against pack law. The sentence applies to you as well. Then execute me instead of her. Ulrich had moved to stand between Adelheid and the assembled council, had spread his arms wide. I'm the heir you wanted dead. I'm the Alpha who broke your precious blood oath. She's just an Omega who loved the wrong wolf. Let her go, and I'll submit to whatever punishment you decree. Adelheid had felt something crack in her chest at his words. Ulrich, no. I should have protected you 3 years ago, he'd said without turning around. I should have stood with you when they came to Schwanden. I should have faced this council then instead of running. But I was a coward who thought distance would keep you safe. He'd finally looked back at her, and his silver eyes held oceans of regret. I'm not running anymore. The Alpha Kings had exchanged glances, had engaged in a silent conversation that held 3 centuries of pack law and political calculation. Finally, Ulrich's father had spoken. The challenge is accepted. But not as you propose. The old Alpha's voice had hardened into something ancient and absolute. If you truly believe this Omega is innocent, if you truly believe your offspring deserves to live, then prove it. Prove that the forbidden bloodline isn't the threat we believe it to be. Bring the child before this council. Let us see what manner of wolf you've created. And if he passes our judgment, both of you go free. The trap in the offer was obvious. Bring Caspar before the council, and he'd be at the mercy of wolves who'd spent 3 years trying to kill him. Refuse, and Adelheid would die while Ulrich watched. There was no winning move, no clever solution, no way to satisfy pack law without sacrificing everything they'd fought to protect. Ulrich had stood frozen, caught between love and duty, between the Omega who'd borne his child and the child who'd never known his father. That's when Adelheid had done the impossible. She'd broken free of the silver chains. Later, the council would debate how an Omega had shattered restraints designed to hold alpha wolves. Some would claim she'd been planning it all along, had been slowly weakening the links during the journey. Others would insist it was the power of the broken mating bond, that Ulrich's proximity had given her strength she shouldn't possess. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Adelheid Brunner had been a seer's granddaughter, and in the moment of absolute crisis, her grandmother's gift had finally awakened fully. She'd seen the future. All of it. Every possible path, every choice, every outcome spiraling out from this single moment. And in every vision except one, Caspar died before his 10th birthday. I'll tell you where he is, Adelheid had said, and her voice carried the eerie certainty of someone who'd seen beyond the veil. I'll bring him before this council. But first, you need to understand what you're really asking for. She'd turned to face both Alpha Kings, had let her Omega wolf surface with power that made the ancient rulers lean back on their thrones. 3 years ago, you declared that any child born of Gotthard and Brunner blood would be a threat to pack law. You were right. But not in the way you think. She'd stepped forward, and the council guards hadn't moved to stop her. Caspar isn't a threat because he could unite your kingdoms. He's a threat because he proves that everything you've built your power on is a lie. Explain, Ulrich's father had commanded. The blood oath that keeps your territories separate was never about peace. It was about control. About making sure no wolf could rise above the Alpha Kings. No bloodline could challenge your absolute authority. You've spent 3 centuries convincing your packs that mixing certain bloodlines would bring disaster, but the real disaster would be wolves realizing they don't need you. Adelheid had looked at the assembled crowd, at hundreds of wolves hanging on her every word. My son exists, and your kingdoms haven't fallen. He's lived for 3 years, and the territories haven't gone to war. The only disaster his existence has caused is to your egos. The silence that followed was deafening. You speak treason, the other Alpha King had said, but his voice lacked conviction. I speak truth. And you know it, because you've been receiving reports for 3 years about a child who should have brought chaos but has brought nothing except fear from 2 old wolves clinging to power. Adelheid had pulled a folded paper from her tunic. How she'd hidden it through the journey and restraints, no one knew, and held it up. This is a letter from the Healers Guild. They've been tracking Casper since his birth. Do you want to know what they've found? She'd read from the letter without waiting for permission. The child designated as forbidden bloodline shows no signs of the instability predicted by pack law. His wolf is strong but controlled. His temperament is gentle and less threatened. His bond to his mother is typical of any Omega-reared child. In our professional assessment, there is no evidence to support the claim that mixed bloodlines produce unstable or dangerous wolves. The words had fallen like stones into still water, sending ripples through the assembled council. Lies, one of the jurists had declared. The Healers Guild has no jurisdiction. The Healers Guild predates both your kingdoms, Adelheid had interrupted. They were documenting bloodlines and wolf health when your ancestors were still fighting over scraps. And they've signed this letter with their official seal, which means it's admissible as evidence under the very pack law you claim to uphold. Ulrich had moved to stand beside her then. Had taken her hand in a gesture that was both protective and supportive. My father once told me that pack law exists to protect the weak from the strong. But what I've learned in 7 years of exile is that pack law has become a weapon the strong use against the weak. You've declared my son guilty of existing. You've sentenced an Omega to death for loving. And you've called it justice. The old Alpha King had studied his son with an expression that held layers of emotion too complex to name. If we allow this child to live, if we acknowledge that the forbidden bloodline isn't dangerous, we undermine 3 centuries of precedent. Packs will question other laws. Wolves will demand justification for decrees we've issued. The entire structure that keeps our territories stable will collapse. Good, Ulrich had said simply. Maybe it's time for that structure to fall. Maybe it's time for wolves to govern themselves based on what's right instead of what's traditional. Maybe it's time for Alpha Kings to earn their authority instead of demanding it by birthright. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. The Alpha Kings had exchanged another glance, longer this time, weighted with calculations that Adelheid could only guess at. Finally, Ulrich's father had nodded slowly. You've made your case, heir of Gotthard. And while we don't appreciate having our authority challenged in such a public forum, his gaze swept across the assembled wolves, we are not tyrants who ignore evidence when it contradicts our assumptions. What happened next shocked everyone present, including Adelheid and Ulrich. The Alpha King stood from his throne, descended the steps, and approached his son with the measured gait of a wolf who'd made a decision that would alter history. He stopped 3 paces away, and for a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other across 7 years of exile and betrayal. You were always the stronger wolf, the old Alpha said quietly. Not in power but in conviction. When I gave you the blood oath 7 years ago, when I commanded you to slaughter the Riverside Pack for the crime of harboring refugees, you refused. You told me that strength without mercy was just brutality with a crown. Called you weak. I declared you dead. I spent 7 years convincing myself I'd made the right choice. He'd paused, and something that might have been shame flickered across his ancient face. "I was wrong." The words rippled through the assembled wolves like lightning. An Alpha King admitting error was unheard of, unprecedented, the kind of thing that would be discussed in hushed tones for generations. "The Omega is right," Ulrich's father continued, his voice carrying across the grounds. "We've built our kingdoms on fear disguised as tradition. We've called it pack law when it was really pack control. And we've sacrificed countless wolves on the altar of our own pride." He turned to address the other Alpha King, his rival of 3 centuries. "Brother, it's time we ended this." The second Alpha King had risen slowly, and Adelheid had seen something in his face that explained decades of warfare. These 2 males weren't just rivals. They were actually brothers, split by a succession crisis so old that most wolves had forgotten they shared blood. "You would throw away 300 years of tradition," the other king said, "for a grandson you've never met? I would throw away 300 years of lies for a future that doesn't repeat our mistakes." Ulrich's father had extended his hand to his estranged brother. "The blood oath that separated our kingdoms was signed the day we went to war over Father's throne. We've been making our packs suffer for our family grudge ever since. Perhaps it's time we chose differently." The moment stretched like pulled wire, taut enough to snap. Then the other Alpha King had descended from his throne, had crossed the space between them, and had clasped his brother's hand in the traditional wolf greeting that signified the end of hostilities. The crowd had erupted in chaos, some wolves cheering, others shouting protests, the council jurists calling for order while the world they'd known dissolved around them. But Adelheid had barely heard any of it, because she'd felt the vision slam into her with the force of an avalanche. Her seer sight had opened fully, and what she'd seen had driven her to her knees. Caspar at age 16, standing over a battlefield of broken wolves, his silver eyes empty of everything except rage. In the vision, he wasn't the gentle child she'd raised. He was a weapon forged by grief, a king who'd learned that mercy was weakness, an alpha who'd discovered his parents' sacrifice and turned it into justification for conquest. In the vision, Ulrich was dead. In the vision, Adelheid was a memory he'd learned to hate. In the vision, the Alpha King's worst fears about the forbidden bloodline had come true, not because of what Caspar was, but because of what they'd forced him to become. She'd gasped, had felt Ulrich's hands on her shoulders, had heard his voice calling her name from very far away. When her sight had cleared, she'd found herself surrounded by concerned wolves, the council's medic checking her pulse, and both Alpha Kings staring down at her with expressions of alarm. "What did you see?" Ulrich had demanded, and she'd heard the fear beneath his alpha command. "The future," she'd whispered. "And we have to change it. Now." She'd struggled to her feet, had pushed away the medic's helping hands, had looked directly at the Alpha Kings with eyes that still held the afterimage of apocalypse. "You're making the right choice by ending the blood feud. But you're making it for the wrong reasons, and that matters. If you're doing this because you feel guilty, because you want to ease your consciences, because you think acknowledging one forbidden bloodline will satisfy the packs, it won't be enough. The damage goes deeper than one child." "Explain," Ulrich's uncle had commanded. "There are 17 other forbidden bloodlines scattered across your territories. 17 other wolves who were born in secret, raised in hiding, taught that their very existence is criminal. Some are children like Caspar. Others are adults who've spent decades living under false names, suppressing their true bloodlines, terrified of discovery." She'd pulled out another paper. This one she'd stolen from a council archive during her trial, a theft that could have earned another death sentence if anyone had noticed. "I found the records. The Healers Guild has been tracking them all, documenting them, waiting for the day when pack law would change enough that they could reveal the truth." She'd handed the paper to the nearest Alpha King, had watched his face drain of color as he'd read the list of names, bloodlines and locations. "These wolves are living weapons," Adelheid had continued, her voice hard as steel. "Not because they're inherently dangerous, but because you've given them every reason to hate the system that condemned them. If you end the blood feud but don't address this, if you give my son freedom but leave these 17 wolves in hiding, you're creating the conditions for the exact war you've been trying to prevent." Ulrich had taken the paper from his father, had scanned the list, and his expression had shifted through shock into something darker. Half of these wolves are older than me. They've been hiding for decades. He'd looked up at his father with accusation burning in his eyes. You knew. You had to know. The Healers Guild reports to the throne. We knew of some, the old Alpha had admitted. We thought. We believed that as long as they remained hidden, as long as they didn't challenge pack law openly, they weren't a threat. You thought wrong, Adelheid had said flatly. Because I've been in contact with them. All of them. For 3 years while I was running with Casper, I was also building a network. An underground alliance of forbidden bloodlines who've been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. She'd smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut. You wanted to know where my son is. He's with them. He's in a sanctuary we've built in the disputed territories, where your pack law doesn't reach, where wolves can exist without fear of execution for the crime of their birth. The silence that followed was absolute. Then chaos erupted again, but this time it was the council in an uproar, jurists shouting about treason and rebellion, guards moving toward Adelheid with weapons drawn, the Alpha Kings trying to restore order while their carefully constructed authority crumbled around them. Ulrich had shifted partially, had let his alpha power flood the grounds in a wave that forced every wolf except the kings to their knees. Stand down, he'd commanded, and the voice that came out was pure alpha dominance, the kind of power that made submission involuntary. The Omega speaks under my protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me. You protect a rebel, one of the council jurists had gasped from his knees. She admits to building a resistance. She admits to building a refuge, Ulrich had corrected. There's a difference. One is about overthrowing kingdoms. The other is about surviving them. He'd released his power, had let the wolves rise, had turned to face his father with the bearing of a wolf who'd finally found his purpose. You have a choice, father. You can continue hunting forbidden bloodlines and turn those 17 wolves into actual enemies. Or you can acknowledge that pack law needs to evolve, that the kingdoms need reform, and that maybe, just maybe, your grandson and the others like him represent a future worth building instead of destroying. The Alpha Kings had looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them again. Then Ulrich's father had done something that would be recorded in every pack history for the next 1,000 years. He'd knelt before his son. I am old, he'd said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. Old and tired and burdened by 3 centuries of decisions that seemed right at the time but looked like cruelty in hindsight. Perhaps it's time for a younger wolf to lead. Perhaps it's time for a king who understands that strength and mercy are not opposites. Brother, the other Alpha King had said warningly. What are you doing? I'm abdicating. The words fell like stones. In favor of my heir. In favor of a wolf who's proven he'll choose conscience over convenience, even when it costs him everything. He'd looked up at Ulrich with eyes that held 300 years of regret. The throne is yours, son. Do better than I did. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reshape the political landscape of every wolf territory in existence. Ulrich had stared at his father, at the throne that was suddenly his, at the Omega standing beside him who just admitted to building a rebellion, and made a decision that proved exactly why he deserved to rule. I accept, he'd said. On 3 conditions. The assembled wolves had held their collective breath. First, the blood oath that separates the kingdoms is dissolved. No more forbidden bloodlines. No more executions for the crime of love. Pack law will be rewritten to reflect what we actually are instead of what we fear we might become. His father had nodded. Agreed. Second, the 17 wolves in hiding receive full pardons and restoration of their bloodline rights. They'll be given land, titles, and positions in the new council that reflects the United Kingdom we're building. Ambitious, his uncle had murmured. But agreed. Third, Ulrich had turned to Adelheid, had taken her hand, and what he'd done next had shocked her more than anything else that had happened in this impossible day. He'd knelt. The newly crowned Alpha King had knelt before an Omega in front of hundreds of witnesses. Adelheid Brunner, will you let me fix what I broke? Will you give me the chance to be the father our son deserves, and the mate you should have had 3 years ago? Adelheid had looked down at him, at this alpha who'd spent 7 years in exile, 3 years as a shadow guardian, and was now offering her a crown she'd never wanted. Her heart had said yes immediately, but her mind had remembered the vision. Caspar at 16, standing over bodies, empty-eyed and brutal. I saw something, she'd said quietly, aware that the entire council was watching. I saw what happens if Caspar grows up learning that power is the only thing that matters, that mercy is weakness, that the strong rule and the weak suffer. I saw him become exactly what the Alpha Kings feared. She'd pulled Ulrich to his feet, had cupped his face in her hands. So yes, I'll give you that chance. But on one condition of my own. We raise him together, but we don't raise him to be a king. We raise him to be a wolf who understands that true strength is choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. We raise him to know that his parents sacrificed everything not so he could rule, but so he could be free. Ulrich had smiled, and it was the first genuine expression of joy Adelheid had seen on his face in 3 years. I can work with that. He'd kissed her then, in front of the council and the Alpha Kings and hundreds of witnesses. And the broken mating bond that should have been dead had flared back to life like a phoenix. The sensation had been unlike anything documented in pack history. Bonds didn't heal once broken, everyone knew that, but everyone had been wrong about a lot of things today. That's when the scream had split the air. It came from the eastern ridge, high and terrified and unmistakably young. Every wolf had spun toward the sound, had scented the wind. And Adelheid had felt her heart stop because she knew that scream, would have known it anywhere. Caspar. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be safe in the sanctuary with the other forbidden bloodlines. But she'd forgotten one critical detail about 3-year-olds. They didn't follow plans. They followed their hearts. And Caspar's heart had led him straight to his mother. The child had appeared at the tree line, tears streaming down his face. His small body shaking with the effort of a shift he wasn't old enough to control properly. Behind him, stumbling and clearly exhausted, were 3 wolves she recognized, members of the Forbidden Bloodline network who'd been protecting him. Mama! Caspar had cried, and started running down the ridge toward the council grounds. Toward hundreds of wolves who'd spent 3 years being told he was a threat. Toward Alpha Kings who just promised reform but whose guards still carried weapons. Toward a future that balanced on a knife's edge. Adelheid had moved without thinking. Had shifted mid-stride and crossed the distance to her son in seconds. She'd reached him just as one of the older council guards had raised a crossbow. Old habits dying hard, old fears overriding new oaths. She'd put herself between the weapon and her child. Had snarled with every ounce of Omega fury she possessed, and watched the guard hesitate. Then Ulrich had been there, in full alpha form, massive and terrifying and radiating enough power to make the guard drop the crossbow like it had burned him. The newly crowned king had shifted back to human, had gathered Caspar into his arms. The child had gone still immediately, recognizing something in the alpha's scent even if he didn't understand what it meant. This, Ulrich had said. His voice carrying across the grounds as he'd held up his son for all to see, is Caspar Brunner von Gotthard, heir to 2 kingdoms that no longer exist because as of today we're building something new. He is not a threat. He is not a weapon. He is not a forbidden bloodline that needs to be controlled or destroyed. He is a child, my child. And anyone who raises a weapon against him will answer to me personally. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock or uncertainty. This was decision. Every wolf present choosing in real time whether to accept this new reality or cling to the old laws. It was one of the older wolves, a grandmother who'd lost her own children to pack law's cruelty, who'd spoken first. The alpha speaks wisdom. The child is innocent. Let the old laws die with the old kings. Another voice had joined hers. Then another. Then dozens, until the council grounds had echoed with wolves choosing change over tradition, mercy over fear. The remaining hours of that day passed in a blur of formal declarations and ceremony. The blood oath was officially dissolved in a ritual that required both Alpha Kings, former kings now, to sign new documents in front of witnesses. The 17 forbidden bloodlines were granted pardons and summoned to the council grounds to receive their restored rights. Ulrich was crowned as the first king of the United Territories in a ceremony that was hastily thrown together but deeply meaningful. And through it all, Caspar had stayed close to Adelheid, this child who'd spent 3 years running and hiding, finally allowed to simply be. The celebrations had stretched into the night, with wolves from both kingdoms mingling freely for the first time in centuries. Adelheid had watched it all with a sense of surreal accomplishment, had held her son while Ulrich handled the political necessities of his new position, had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd actually won. That's when she'd felt it, the vision rising again, darker than before. She'd tried to push it away, had tried to focus on the present moment, but seer sight didn't work that way. When a vision demanded attention, it took it by force. This time, what she saw made the previous vision look gentle by comparison. Caspar at age 10, taken from her in the night by wolves who believed the old ways were right. Caspar at 12, raised by a faction of traditionalists who'd gone underground rather than accept reform. Caspar at 16, returned to them as a weapon sharpened on hatred, convinced that his parents had betrayed him by trying to change a system that had declared him abomination. In this vision, Ulrich died trying to save their son from himself. In this vision, Adelheid watched her child become a monster. In this vision, the United Territories collapsed into civil war within a generation. She'd gasped, had stumbled, and this time when her sight cleared, she'd found herself in the medical tent with Ulrich beside her and both former Alpha Kings standing at the foot of her bed with expressions of deep concern. "Another vision?" Ulrich had asked gently. She'd nodded, had clutched his hand like a lifeline. "We haven't won. We've just changed the shape of the battle. There are wolves who'll never accept this reform, who'll see Caspar as proof that the old laws were right. They'll wait until we're comfortable, until we think we're safe, and then they'll strike. Then we prepare for them," Ulrich had said firmly. "We build defenses, we train guards, we—" "No," Adelheid had cut him off, and her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen beyond normal time. "If we turn this new kingdom into a fortress, we prove their point. If we raise Caspar surrounded by guards and fear, we create exactly what they expect. A tyrant who rules through strength because he's never known anything else." The former Alpha Kings had exchanged glances, and Ulrich's father had spoken carefully. "What are you suggesting, daughter?" "I'm suggesting we do something unprecedented." Adelheid had sat up, had looked at each of them in turn. "We send Caspar away. Not in hiding this time but openly. We send him to live among normal wolves, in normal packs, where he can grow up without the weight of crowns and prophecies and forbidden bloodlines hanging over his head. We let him be a child." "Absolutely not," Ulrich had said immediately. "I just got him back. I'm not losing him again." "You're not losing him. You're giving him the gift we never had. A normal childhood. Don't you see? The traditionalists expect us to hoard him, to raise him as a prince, to prove that forbidden bloodlines produce superior wolves. If we do that, we're just reinforcing everything they believe. But if we send him away, if we trust the very packs we're asking to trust us, we prove that we believe in the reform we're building." The logic was sound, terrible, and completely unacceptable to every parental instinct Adelheid possessed. But the seer sight didn't lie, and every future where they kept Caspar close ended in tragedy. They'd debated for hours. Ulrich had argued that they'd already sacrificed 3 years, that they deserved time as a family. The former Alpha Kings had worried about the political implications, about what message it sent if the king's heir was raised elsewhere. The council jurists had presented dozens of legal complications. But Adelheid had held firm, because she'd seen what happened if they chose wrong. And eventually, exhausted and heartbroken, Ulrich had agreed. They'd selected the Healers' Guild as Caspar's temporary guardians. The guild was neutral territory, respected across all packs, and specialized in raising young wolves who needed special care. Caspar would live among the healers until his 10th birthday, learning their trade, growing up surrounded by wolves who valued compassion over conquest. He would visit his parents regularly. He would know who he was, where he came from, what his bloodline meant. But he would also know what it meant to be normal, to be judged for his character instead of his heritage, to choose his own path instead of following one laid out by prophecy and politics. The morning they'd taken him to the Healers' Guild had been the hardest day of Adelheid's life. Harder than the barn fire, harder than the trial, harder than 3 years of running. She'd knelt before her son, had held his small face in her hands, and tried to find words that could explain why his parents were sending him away again. "You're going to live with the healers for a while," she'd said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "They'll teach you how to help wolves who are hurting, how to use your strength to protect instead of harm. Will you visit?" Caspar had asked, and his silver eyes, so like his father's, had held understanding beyond his years. "Every week. Your father and I will come every single week, and you'll have the best teachers, the kindest guardians, and—" "You're doing this because you saw something bad," Caspar had interrupted, and Adelheid had felt her heart crack because of course he'd figured it out. He was his mother's son. She'd nodded slowly. "I saw futures where keeping you close turned you into something dark. I saw you become the monster they said forbidden bloodlines create. And I can't let that happen, Caspar. I'd rather have you hate me and stay good than love me and become evil." The child had thought about this with the seriousness that 3-year-olds sometimes showed when the world asked them to be wise beyond their years. Then he'd hugged her with all the strength in his small body. "I won't be a monster, Mama," he'd whispered. "I promise. Even if it's hard. Even if I get angry. I'll remember what you taught me." Ulrich had knelt beside them then, had wrapped his arms around both his mate and his son, and for a moment they'd been complete. A family carved from sacrifice and love and choices that had no good options. "Your mother and I will build a kingdom worth inheriting," Ulrich had said into his son's hair. "And when you're ready, when you've had the childhood we never could give you before, you'll come home to a world that celebrates what you are instead of fearing it." They'd walked away from the Healers' Guild that day hand in hand. 2 wolves who'd won everything and lost everything in the same breath. 7 years passed. The United Territories flourished under Ulrich's rule. The reforms he and Adelheid had fought for took root slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The 17 forbidden bloodlines became 17 families who contributed to the kingdom's growth. The disputed territories became settlement lands where young wolves could build new packs without the burden of 3 centuries of baggage. The Healers' Guild expanded, training new generations in medicine and mercy. But there were shadows in the success. Adelheid's visions hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd intensified. She saw futures that branched and twisted, possibilities that shifted with every small decision. And in many of them, she saw the faction of traditionalists that had never dissolved, that had simply gone underground, waiting. They called themselves the Pure Blood Council, and they believed that diluting bloodlines weakened wolf kind. They believed that the old Alpha Kings had been right to enforce separation, that forbidden bloodlines were abominations, that Ulrich's reforms would lead to the extinction of true wolves. And they believed that Caspar von Gotthard was proof of everything they feared. Adelheid had tracked them obsessively, had used her seer sight to map their movements, their meetings, their plans. She'd brought intelligence to Ulrich weekly, had watched him dispatch guards to investigate, had seen the Pure Blood Council stay just ahead of capture. They were patient, strategic, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came on Caspar's 10th birthday. The day he was supposed to return home permanently, to finally take his place as the heir to the United Territories, to reunite with the parents who'd sacrificed everything to keep him safe. Adelheid had woken that morning with the worst vision yet. The Healers' Guild burning. Caspar missing. A ransom demand delivered to the throne. Abdicate or watch your son die. She'd told Ulrich immediately. They'd mobilized every guard, every tracker, every wolf loyal to the throne. They'd ridden toward the Healers' Guild with an army at their backs. Had pushed their wolves to the breaking point to arrive before the vision came true. They'd been too late. The guild was in flames when they arrived, healers fleeing with injured wolves, and in the center of the chaos stood a figure Adelheid recognized from her visions. Dietrich Weber, former council jurist, leader of the Pure Blood faction, and the wolf who'd been orchestrating this rebellion for 7 years. He held Caspar by the throat, the boy struggling but unable to break free, and beside him stood a dozen wolves in the masks that traditionalists wore when they performed blood rituals. "King Ulrich," Dietrich had called out, his voice carrying over the roar of flames. "You've built a pretty kingdom on the graves of everything our ancestors fought for. Time to tear it down." Ulrich had shifted partially, had let his alpha power roll across the grounds in waves. "Let my son go, and I'll give you a clean death. Hold him, and I'll make your end last days." "Threats from the false king," Dietrich had laughed. "You're not a true alpha, Ulrich von Gotthard. You're a traitor who chose mercy over strength, who mated an omega when you should have taken an alpha female to produce strong heirs. This child..." He'd shaken Caspar like a rag doll. "This is what happens when bloodlines mix. We controlled. Nothing like the legends promised." Adelheid had felt Caspar's fear through the mating bond she'd reformed with Ulrich, not her own bond to her son, but the echo of his terror that Ulrich carried. The child had been trained by healers in controlling his wolf, in choosing negotiation over violence. He'd never learned to fight because they'd deliberately taught him peace. And now he was helpless against wolves who'd spent 7 years preparing for war. That's when Adelheid had done something she'd never done before. She'd weaponized her seer sight. She'd opened herself fully to the visions, had let every possible future flood through her at once, and had spoken with the voice of someone who'd seen the end of this story in 1,000 different ways. "Dietrich Weber," she'd said, and her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "In 47 futures, you kill Caspar and trigger a civil war that ends your bloodline within 3 years. In 63 futures, you try to escape with him and die before you reach the border. In 212 futures, you surrender now and live to see your grandchildren choose the reforms you despise." She'd stepped forward, had let her Omega wolf show through her human form in a display that made even Ulrich step back. "I am a seer, Dietrich. I've watched you die in more ways than you can imagine. I've seen every choice you might make, every path you might take. And I'm telling you now, there is exactly one future where you get what you truly want." The traditionalist leader had faltered, had loosened his grip on Caspar just slightly. "What future?" "The one where you let my son go and challenge me directly. One seer against one traditionalist. If you win, Ulrich abdicates and the old laws are restored. If I win, the Pure Blood Council dissolves and you face justice under the new laws." The offer was insane. Adelheid was an Omega who'd spent 7 years in administration, not combat. Dietrich was a trained warrior who'd survived the last territory war. The match was so unbalanced that even Ulrich had shouted protest, had tried to intervene, but she'd stopped him with a look that said, "Trust me." Because she'd seen this future, this exact moment, this precise gamble, and she knew how it ended. Dietrich had studied her for a long moment, had calculated odds and politics and legacy. Then he'd thrown Caspar toward the healers, the boy caught by gentle hands, and had shifted into his full wolf form. "Agreed," he'd growled. "I'll enjoy tearing apart the Omega who destroyed our way of life." They'd fought in the center of the burning guild, surrounded by wolves from both sides, with the future of the kingdom hanging on an Omega who'd spent 3 years running and 7 years planning. Adelheid had shifted, had let her smaller wolf face off against Dietrich's massive form, and had done something that no one expected. She'd gone completely still. Dietrich had lunged, jaws open, going for the kill strike that would end this quickly. And Adelheid had simply stood there, had let him come, had waited until the last possible second before she'd spoken directly into his mind through the alpha command that Omega wolves weren't supposed to possess. "See what I see." Then she'd forced her seer sight into his consciousness. Every future, every path, every consequence of his choices flooding into Dietrich's mind at once. He'd seen himself kill her and watch the kingdom tear itself apart. He'd seen himself win and realize that the old laws he'd fought for would bring only suffering. He'd seen his grandchildren live in the reformed world and thrive in ways his generation never could. He'd seen the truth that he'd spent 7 years denying. The forbidden bloodlines weren't the threat. The refusal to adapt was. The massive wolf had stumbled, had collapsed, had shifted back to human form with tears streaming down his face. "How do you live with this?" he'd gasped. "How do you see all of this and not go mad?" "I choose which future to build," Adelheid had said gently, shifting back herself. "Every day I see 1,000 ways the world could end, and I choose to fight for the one way it could heal. That's what seers do. That's what you could do too, if you chose differently." Dietrich had knelt there in the ash and smoke, the fight draining out of him, and had made a choice that would echo through history. He'd submitted. Not just to Adelheid, but to the vision she'd shown him, to the future that could exist if wolves chose growth over tradition. "I yield," he'd said, and the pure blood council wolves behind him had shifted uncertainly. "The Omega Seer has shown me truths I can't deny. The reforms will stand." The surrender had been complete, shocking, and absolutely necessary. With Dietrich's submission, the last organized resistance to the United Territories collapsed. The traditionalists who'd followed him laid down their weapons, accepted pardons under the new laws, and slowly, painfully, began to integrate into the kingdom Ulrich had built. But Adelheid hadn't felt victorious. She'd felt exhausted down to her bones, weighted by the knowledge of what she'd just done. Forcing a vision into another wolf's mind was considered a violation of the deepest kind, a breach of will that was barely different from mind control. She'd won by becoming exactly what she'd fought against, a wolf who used power to force others into compliance. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the Healers Guild were filled with recovery and reconstruction. The guild was rebuilt stronger than before. The Pure Blood Council members were given the choice of integration or exile. Most chose integration once they'd been shown what Adelheid had shown Dietrich. Caspar was finally officially brought home to stay. And Adelheid had locked herself in her chambers for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, haunted by what she'd done. When Ulrich had finally convinced her to open the door, when he'd held her while she'd wept with guilt and relief and exhaustion, she'd confessed the truth she'd been carrying since the moment she'd forced her sight into Dietrich's mind. "I saw his death," she'd whispered. "In 47 of those futures where he killed Caspar, I saw exactly how he would die. And I could have just told him, could have warned him, could have let him choose. But I forced the visions into his mind because it was faster, cleaner, more certain. I took away his choice, Ulrich. I became exactly what the traditionalists feared, a wolf with power using it to control others." Ulrich had been quiet for a long time, holding her while she shook. Then he'd said something that would take her years to fully understand. "You gave him more choice than he gave our son. You showed him futures and let him decide which one to build. Yes, you forced the visions. Yes, it was violent. But you didn't take away his agency. You gave him information he needed to make an informed choice. That's not control. That's complicated mercy." The first real conversation Adelheid had with Caspar after bringing him home had been harder than any battle. The boy, 10 years old now, tall for his age, with his father's silver eyes and his mother's sharp mind, had watched her with an expression that held too much understanding. "The healers told me what you did," he'd said quietly. They'd been in the palace gardens, the rebuilt kingdom stretching out around them. "They said you forced a vision into someone's mind. They said it's the worst thing a seer can do." Adelheid had nodded, had refused to lie to her son. "It is. And I'll carry that choice for the rest of my life." "Why did you do it?" "Because you were in danger, and I saw a path that would save you. Because I'm your mother, and protecting you is worth more to me than being a good person. Because sometimes the right choice is also the terrible choice." She'd met his eyes, had refused to look away from the judgment she saw there. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Caspar. I'm asking you to learn from my mistakes. To understand that power without restraint becomes cruelty, even when it starts from love." Caspar had been quiet for a long moment, processing with the seriousness that 7 years among healers had taught him. Then he'd said something that broke her heart and healed it simultaneously. "The healers taught me that healing sometimes requires causing pain. That setting a broken bone hurts worse than leaving it crooked, but leaving it crooked cripples you forever. He'd taken her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers. Maybe what you did was like that. It hurt that wolf to see the truth, but leaving him blind would have crippled the whole kingdom. Out of the mouths of children came the wisdom that adults spent lifetimes seeking. Adelheid had pulled her son into her arms, had held him while tears streamed down her face, and had felt something shift in her understanding of power and responsibility. The months that followed were the most peaceful the United Territories had known in 3 centuries. Ulrich's reforms took deeper root. The forbidden bloodlines who'd been pardoned became productive members of society, including several who took positions on the new High Council. The disputed territories filled with new settlements. The Healers Guild trained record numbers of young wolves in medicine and conflict resolution. And Caspar grew up in a palace that felt more like a home than a fortress, learning from his father how to lead with strength tempered by compassion, learning from his mother how to see futures and choose wisely which ones to build. But Adelheid's visions never stopped entirely. She still saw darkness on the horizon, threats that would come in 5 years, 10 years, 20. She saw the United Territories face challenges that would test everything they'd built. She saw her son grow into a leader who would be tested in ways that would make their battles look simple. But she also saw something else. Hope. Possibility. Futures where wolves chose differently because one Omega had refused to accept that forbidden bloodlines meant forbidden love. 5 years after Caspar's return on his 15th birthday, Adelheid had been in her study reviewing healer reports when Ulrich had entered with an expression she recognized. He'd received troubling news. The Northern Territories are reporting strange wolf sightings, he'd said without preamble. Massive packs moving south. Refugees fleeing something they won't name. The scouts say it looks like the beginning of a migration. Adelheid had felt the vision rise immediately. This was one she'd been expecting, dreading, knowing was inevitable. It's not a migration. It's an invasion. The Arctic packs are moving south because their hunting grounds are failing. Climate change, the healers call it. The prey animals are dying, and the wolves are starving. Can we negotiate? Ulrich had moved to the map on her wall, had traced the northern borders with one finger. Offer them settlement lands in exchange for peaceful integration. We can try. She'd pulled out documents she'd been preparing for this exact moment. But there's a complication. The Arctic packs have their own forbidden bloodlines, Ulrich. Wolves they've kept hidden for centuries. Outcasts who made across pack boundaries. They're coming south because their own leaders declared them expendable, refused them resources, let them starve. The implications had hung heavy in the air. The United Territories had built their entire identity on accepting forbidden bloodlines, on proving that mixed bloodlines weren't threats. If they turned away the Arctic packs now, they'd be hypocrites. If they accepted them without preparation, they'd strain their resources to breaking. That night, at dinner with their family, Caspar, now a thoughtful 15-year-old who'd inherited his mother's gift for seeing patterns, and their 2 younger children, twins born 3 years ago who were normal in every way except their absolute fearlessness, Adelheid had brought up the situation. The kingdom is going to face a test, she'd said carefully. People will come who need help, but helping them will be hard. Some wolves will say we should close our borders, protect what's ours. What do you think we should do? Caspar had answered immediately, with the certainty of youth and the wisdom of someone raised by healers. We help them. That's what the kingdom is for. What's the point of building something new if we just become the old kings in different crowns? His younger sister, Greta, had piped up with the bluntness of a 6-year-old. But what if they're mean? What if they don't want to follow our rules? Then we teach them better rules, her twin brother Werner had said. Like Mama and Papa taught the bad wolves who wanted to hurt Caspar. The simplicity of children's logic, the clarity of seeing problems without 3 centuries of baggage weighing down every decision. Ulrich had caught Adelheid's eye across the table, and in that look had passed a conversation they'd had 1,000 times. How do we preserve this innocence while preparing them for the reality of leadership? The Arctic packs had arrived 2 weeks later, hundreds of wolves in various states of starvation and desperation, led by a grizzled alpha named Heir who'd spent 40 years fighting her own kingdom's bloodline laws. She'd come to the border with her outcasts, had requested asylum under the United Territories' reformed laws, and had made it clear that they would die before going back. The High Council had been divided. Half wanted to accept them immediately, proof that the reforms worked across all territories. Half wanted to establish quotas, background checks, integration periods, reasonable precautions that felt like the beginning of the exclusions they'd fought to end. Adelheid had sat in the council chamber listening to wolves debate the fate of refugees, and had felt history threatening to repeat itself. So she'd done something unprecedented. She'd invited Heir to address the council directly. The Arctic Alpha had stood before the assembled leaders of the United Territories, her wolf thin from starvation but her spine straight with pride, and had told them a story that echoed Adelheid's own. "My daughter made it a wolf from a rival pack 30 years ago," Heidi had said, her voice rough from years of harsh winds and harsher laws. The Arctic kings declared their offspring forbidden bloodlines. 17 children were born from that union and others like it. The kings ordered them killed. I refused. I gathered every outcast, every forbidden bloodline, every wolf who'd been declared expendable, and we survived together in the harshest territory imaginable. She'd paused, had looked directly at Caspar, who sat beside his father in the place of honor reserved for the heir. "I've heard stories about you, boy. They say you're the forbidden bloodline that changed a kingdom. They say your mother ran for 3 years to keep you alive. They say your father died and came back for you. Is it true?" Caspar had stood, this 15-year-old who carried the weight of prophecy and reform, and had answered with the honesty his parents had taught him. "It's true. My mother ran. My father protected us from shadows. And when I was old enough to understand, they taught me that being forbidden isn't the same as being wrong. That the laws that condemned me were laws that needed to change." He'd stepped down from the dais, had crossed the council chamber to stand before Heir, and had done something that would be painted on palace walls for generations. He'd knelt before the refugee Alpha. "You kept 17 children alive in impossible conditions. You chose their lives over your comfort. You came here knowing you might be turned away, but hoping we'd be better than the kings you fled." His voice had carried across the chamber, young but certain. "On behalf of the United Territories, on behalf of every forbidden bloodline that was given a second chance, I ask the council, how could we possibly turn you away?" The silence that followed was profound. Then Adelheid had stood, had moved to stand beside her son, and had addressed the council with the voice of a seer who'd spent 15 years learning how to use her gift without weaponizing it. "I've seen the futures where we accept these refugees and the futures where we turn them away. In the first set, we face challenges. Resource strain, cultural integration, conflicts that will test our patience. But in 20 years, those challenges have made us stronger. In the second set, we save ourselves some difficulty now and become exactly what we fought against. Wolves who say we value life but only when it's convenient." The vote had been close, closer than anyone wanted to admit. But it had passed. The Arctic refugees were granted asylum, given settlement lands in the Northern Territories, and integrated into the kingdom with support from the Healers Guild and volunteers from the forbidden bloodline families who remembered what it meant to be outcasts. The years that followed tested everything the United Territories had built. There were conflicts, inevitable when different cultures collided. There were wolves who resented the refugees, who claimed they were stealing resources. There were refugees who struggled to adapt to laws that valued negotiation over strength. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty. Arctic wolves teaching southern wolves how to survive in harsh climates. Southern wolves teaching Arctic wolves about healing arts. Children from both groups playing together without knowing or caring about the bloodline feuds that had divided their parents. And through it all, Caspar grew into exactly the leader Adelheid had hoped he'd become. Not because he was powerful, but because he was kind. Not because he commanded loyalty, but because he earned it. Not because he was destined for greatness, but because he chose it every day. On Caspar's 18th birthday, The day he was supposed to be formally acknowledged as crown prince and begin training to take his father's throne, Adelheid had woken from a nightmare that was also a vision. She'd seen Caspar dying. Not in the distant future, not in some abstract battle 20 years hence. Within months. Killed by a threat she couldn't quite see clearly, murdered by a force that moved in the shadows the same way Ulrich once had. She'd told no one. Not Ulrich, not Caspar, not the council. Because in every future where she warned them, where she tried to prevent this death, the kingdom itself fell. Somehow, paradoxically, Caspar's death was tied to the kingdom's survival. The vision was frustratingly unclear about the mechanism, but the outcome was consistent. Save Caspar, lose everything. Let him die, and the United Territories survived another century. It was the cruelest choice she'd ever faced. For 3 months, Adelheid had carried this knowledge alone, had smiled through celebrations, had trained Caspar for leadership while knowing she might be preparing him for a sacrifice. She'd used every seer technique she knew to find a third path, a future where both her son and her kingdom survived, but the visions remained stubbornly binary. The breaking point had come on a quiet evening when Caspar had found her in the gardens, weeping silently among the roses that Ulrich had planted for their 10th anniversary. Her son had sat beside her, this young man who'd grown into his father's strength and her gift for perception, and had simply waited. "I saw something," she'd finally said, because lying to Caspar had never worked. "Something terrible. About me." It wasn't a question. "How did you?" "Because you've been looking at me like you're memorizing my face. Because Papa keeps finding reasons to spend extra time with me. Because Greta and Werner have been unusually clingy." Caspar had taken her hand. "I don't have your seer sight, Mama, but I have your training. Can read patterns. So tell me, how do I die?" The directness of the question had stolen her breath. "I don't know exactly. The vision is unclear about the method. But it's soon, and it's connected to something bigger than just you. And if I live, if you prevent it, the kingdom falls. I've seen it in every variation. Your death somehow preserves everything we've built." Caspar had been quiet for a long time, processing with the same seriousness he'd shown at 3 years old when his mother had sent him away for his own protection. Then he'd said something that shattered and rebuilt her understanding of courage. "Then let it happen." "What?" "Well, Caspar, I'm not. Mama, listen to me." He'd turned to face her fully, his silver eyes, so like his father's, burning with purpose. "You and Papa sacrificed everything to give me life. You ran for 3 years. You faced execution. You reformed an entire kingdom. Also I could exist. If my existence now requires my death to preserve what you built, then that's not tragedy. That's completion. That's the story coming full circle." "You're 18 years old," Adelheid had whispered, tears streaming freely now. "You haven't lived yet. You haven't loved, haven't built your own family, haven't. I've lived more than most wolves live in 100 years. I've been loved by parents who reshaped kingdoms for me. I've been raised by healers who taught me that some things are worth dying for. And I've been shown every day what it means to choose others over yourself." He'd wiped her tears with gentle hands. "If you'd told me 3 months ago, I might have been angry. Scared. But you carried this alone to protect me, the same way you've protected me my whole life. So now let me protect you. Let me choose this." The next 6 weeks were the most precious and painful of Adelheid's life. She and Ulrich had told no one else about the vision. At Caspar's insistence, he wanted his last days to be normal, unmarked by the pall of impending death. So they'd made ordinary memories extraordinary through the simple act of presence. Family dinners became ceremonies of gratitude. Evening walks became pilgrimages. Conversations about nothing became treasures to be hoarded against the coming darkness. Caspar had trained harder, as if trying to pack a lifetime of growth into weeks. He'd spent time with each person who mattered to him. His siblings, the healers who'd raised him, the forbidden bloodline families who saw him as their champion, the Arctic refugees whose children called him the prince who kneels. And 3 days before his 19th birthday, The threat Adelheid had seen in her visions finally revealed itself. A message had arrived at the palace, delivered by a trembling messenger who'd found it tied to a dead wolf at the border. The parchment was old, written in blood, and signed with a seal that hadn't been seen in 20 years. The mark of the original Pure Blood Council, the faction that had supposedly dissolved after Dietrich's surrender. The message was simple and devastating. The false kingdom ends where it began. The forbidden bloodline will burn as it should have burned 18 years ago. The old laws will be restored in his ashes. Ulrich had wanted to mobilize the entire kingdom guard, to protect Caspar with armies. The council had wanted to cancel all public events, to lock the palace down until the threat was eliminated. But Adelheid had seen this response in her visions. Every future where they treated this as a military threat ended with the kingdom torn apart by civil war reignited. The Pure Blood Council had been waiting 18 years for this. They'd infiltrated slowly, recruited carefully, positioned themselves in places where Ulrich's reforms hadn't quite taken root. They'd chosen their moment perfectly. Caspar's 19th birthday, a public celebration where cancelling would look like weakness, where hiding would suggest the reforms were failures. It was a trap designed with surgical precision. And Caspar had insisted on walking into it. "If I hide," he'd argued in the council chamber, "I prove their point. I prove that forbidden bloodlines live in fear, that we've built a kingdom on lies, that the reforms were cosmetic rather than real. But if I go to the celebration, if I stand in public and dare them to act, I force them to show themselves. And once they're visible, you can end them." "You'll die," Ulrich had said flatly, and the pain in his voice had silenced the entire council. "Probably," Caspar had agreed. "But I'll die proving that I'm not afraid. That we're not afraid. That the United Territories believes in its own laws enough to risk everything defending them." The birthday celebration had been planned for months, a public festival in the capital where wolves from all territories would gather to honor the heir who represented unity. Thousands of wolves had come, cramming the streets, filling the squares, celebrating 18 years of reform that had given them freedoms their grandparents couldn't have imagined. Adelheid had stood on the palace balcony beside Ulrich and Caspar, had looked out at the sea of wolves below, and had known with seer certainty that she was watching her son's final hours. The vision had been crystal clear that morning. Caspar would die before sunset, killed in public, his death witnessed by thousands. And somehow, impossibly, his death would save them all. She still didn't understand the mechanism, didn't see how one young wolf's murder could preserve a kingdom, but the visions didn't lie. They were simply cruel in their truth. Caspar had given his speech with the composure of someone 3 times his age. He talked about forbidden bloodlines as bridges instead of threats, about unity as strength rather than weakness, about the future being built by wolves brave enough to choose differently than their ancestors. He'd been magnificent. And then, as the sun had touched the horizon, the attack had come. Not from the crowd, as everyone had expected. Not from a lone assassin with a crossbow. The Pure Blood Council had learned from Dietrich's mistakes. They'd gone bigger, bolder, more theatrical. They'd poisoned the water supply. Every wolf in the capital who'd drunk from the public fountains in the past 6 hours, thousands of them, had begun collapsing simultaneously. Not dead but paralyzed, unable to shift, unable to move. A poison the Healers' Guild had never encountered, something ancient that the Pure Blood Council had kept hidden for decades. The panic had been immediate and absolute. Wolves scrambling for their children, for their mates. Healers rushing through crowds trying to help. And in the chaos, a group of masked wolves had surged toward the palace. Toward Caspar. Ulrich had shifted immediately, had put himself between the attackers and his son, but they'd been ready for him. Silver nets, blessed by old magic that weakened alpha wolves specifically. He'd been tangled, fighting but immobilized, and Adelheid had felt her own wolf rise with fury that made her previous displays of power look gentle. But Caspar had stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "No, Mama," he'd said quietly, even as the masked wolves had closed in. "This is my part. Yours comes after." What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and wept over for generations. Caspar had stepped away from his parents, had walked calmly down the palace steps toward the attackers, and had addressed them with the same steady voice he'd used for his speech. "You want to restore the old laws by killing me. You think my death will prove that forbidden bloodlines are threats, that the reforms were mistakes, that the Alpha Kings were right." He'd stopped 10 paces from the lead attacker. "But you're wrong about what my death will prove." He'd pulled a knife from his belt, not to fight, but to hold up so everyone could see it. "This is the knife my mother carried when she ran with me for 3 years. She kept it to protect me, but also to give me a quick death if we were cornered, if execution would have been worse than mercy. She never had to use it because wolves like you were always just a step behind, just a moment too slow." He'd flipped the knife, had offered the handle to the lead attacker. "But you're not behind anymore. We're here. You've cornered me. And I'm giving you the chance to do what the old laws demanded. Execute the forbidden bloodline publicly, prove your point, show the kingdom that mixing bloodlines creates wolves who deserve death." The masked wolves had hesitated, confused by a victim who was offering compliance. "There's just one condition," Caspar had continued. "Before you kill me, you have to heal the wolves you poisoned. All of them. Show the kingdom that the Pure Blood Council values wolf life, that this isn't about cruelty, that you genuinely believe you're protecting our kind." The trap had sprung beautifully. Because of course the Pure Blood Council had no antidote, they'd poisoned thousands of wolves not as leverage, but as demonstration. They'd wanted to create chaos, to prove that the unified kingdom was fragile, to show that reforms crumbled under pressure. They'd never intended to heal anyone. The lead attacker had laughed, had pulled off his mask to reveal a wolf Adelheid recognized. Heinrich Stein, a council member who'd voted for reform but had apparently been playing along a game. "There is no antidote, boy. That's the point. We've shown that your father's kingdom is weak, that a handful of determined wolves can bring it to its knees. Your death will be the final proof." "No," Caspar had said, and his voice had carried across the square with alpha command he shouldn't possess. "My death will be the beginning of your end. Because you just admitted, in front of thousands of witnesses, that you poisoned innocents, that you have no antidote, that you never planned to heal them. You've admitted that the Pure Blood Council isn't about preserving wolf kind. It's about preserving your power by eliminating anyone who threatens it." The mask had fallen completely. Heinrich had snarled, had lunged with the knife Caspar had given him, and had driven it into the young wolf's chest with all the force of 18 years of suppressed hatred. Caspar had fallen. And Adelheid had felt the exact moment her son's heart stopped beating. The sound that tore from her throat wasn't human or wolf. It was the cry of a parent watching their child die, the howl of a seer who'd seen this coming and couldn't prevent it, the grief of Omega who'd spent 18 years fighting to keep one small life safe only to watch it end exactly as prophesied. Ulrich's roar had shaken the palace foundations as he'd torn through the silver nets with strength that should have been impossible. The remaining attackers had tried to flee, but they'd been surrounded instantly by kingdom guards, by Arctic refugees, by forbidden bloodline families, by every wolf in the capital who hadn't been poisoned and who'd just watched the heir to the United Territories murdered in cold blood. But Adelheid had ignored all of it. She'd run to her son, had gathered his dying body into her arms, had pressed her hands to the wound that was leaking too much blood too quickly. "Caspar," she'd whispered, and her voice broke on his name. "Baby, stay with me. Healers are coming. We can fix this. We can. Mama." His voice was faint, his silver eyes already dimming. "Did I do it right? You did everything right. You were perfect. You were." The sob had cut off her words. "The kingdom. Will it? It'll survive. Because of you. It'll survive because you showed them what courage looks like." She'd stroked his hair. This child who'd been prophecy made flesh, who'd carried the weight of 2 kingdoms from his first breath. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry the visions were right. I'm sorry. Don't." He'd managed a small smile. "You gave me 18 years. That the old laws would have never allowed. That's not failure." He died in her arms as the sun set, with his father howling grief to the darkening sky, with thousands of wolves watching the forbidden bloodline's final breath, with his mother whispering promises she couldn't keep about how this wasn't the end, how she'd find a way to fix this, how seers could sometimes see beyond death. But there was no seeing beyond this. Caspar von Gotthard was gone. What happened in the hour after Caspar's death should have been chaos. Riots, revenge killings, the kingdom tearing itself apart exactly as the Pure Blood Council had planned. Instead, something impossible occurred. The poisoned wolves began to heal. All of them simultaneously, as if Caspar's death had triggered something. They'd started breathing normally, moving, shifting back to wolf form and discovering that whatever had paralyzed them was simply gone. The Healers Guild would spend years trying to understand the mechanism. The best theory they developed was that Caspar's bloodline, that impossible mixing of two royal lines, that forbidden combination that had been declared dangerous, had carried a property they'd never anticipated. When spilled in sufficient quantity, when mixed with the intention of sacrifice rather than violence, his blood had acted as an antidote to the ancient poison. It was magic they didn't understand, biology that didn't make sense, and proof that the forbidden bloodlines weren't just different from normal wolves, they were sometimes miraculously necessary. But Adelheid didn't care about theories or explanations. She cared that her son had bled out to save thousands of wolves he'd never met, that his death had been both murder and healing, that the visions had been right in the cruelest possible way. The trial of Heinrich Stein and the Pure Blood Council conspirators was the fastest in United Territories history. With thousands of witnesses, with public confession, with video evidence that the kingdom's historians had captured, Ulrich had been building an archive of important moments. There was no defense to mount. They were executed within the week, their bloodlines not forbidden but noted, their families given the choice of denouncing their actions or facing exile. Most chose to denounce. Few chose exile. The kingdom stood firm. But the real response came from the wolves themselves. Without prompting from the throne, without official decree, thousands of wolves had begun marking themselves with a new symbol, a silver circle with a broken chain, representing freedom from old laws, unity despite separation, strength through diversity. They called themselves the Caspar's Chosen, and they'd sworn to preserve the reforms that the young heir had died protecting. Within a month, every territory had chapters. Within a year, the movement had spread beyond the United Territories into neighboring kingdoms. Within 5 years, 3 other Alpha Kings had adopted similar reforms, citing the death of Caspar von Gotthard as proof that the old ways required too much innocent blood. The forbidden bloodline had become a martyr, and martyrs changed the world in ways living princes never could. Adelheid spent 6 months unable to access her seer sight. The trauma of watching her visions come true, of being unable to prevent what she'd foreseen, had closed off the gift that had defined her. She was just an Omega again, just a grieving mother, just a wolf who'd lost her child. Ulrich had ruled alone during those months, had made decisions without her insight, had carried the kingdom forward through sheer determination and the knowledge that stopping would dishonor Caspar's sacrifice. The twins had grieved differently. Greta had become quieter, more serious, throwing herself into healer training. Werner had become louder, angrier, demanding to know why his parents hadn't protected Caspar, why they'd let him die. It was Werner's anger that eventually reached Adelheid through her grief. Her 11-year-old son had confronted her in the gardens where she spent most of her days, surrounded by the roses that reminded her of simpler times. "Did you know?" he demanded, tears streaming down his young face. "Did you see it coming? There was no point in lying." "Yes. And you let it happen. You just let him die. I tried to find another way. I spent 3 months searching for a future where both Caspar and the kingdom survived. There wasn't one. Then you should have chosen him." Werner's voice had cracked with betrayal. "He was your son. You should have chosen family over kingdom." Adelheid had knelt before her younger son, had taken his face in her hands, and had told him the truth that she'd been avoiding since Caspar's death. "I did choose family. Every wolf in this kingdom. Thousands of them, Werner. They're all someone's child, someone's mate, someone's parent. When I saw the futures, I saw that choosing Caspar meant all of them dying. Meant you dying. Greta dying. Your father dying. It meant the kingdom collapsing into civil war that would have killed tens of thousands. She'd pulled him close as he'd sobbed. Caspar understood that. He chose to protect his family by protecting everyone. And I chose to let him make that choice because he was 18, old enough to decide what his life meant, old enough to determine his own legacy. I could have overruled him, could have locked him away, could have protected him against his will. But that would have made me no different than the old Alpha Kings who decided wolves' fates without asking what they wanted. Werner had cried in her arms for a long time, and when he'd finally pulled away, something in his face had changed. He looked older, weighted by understanding that children shouldn't need but sometimes had to carry. I still think it's wrong, he'd said quietly. But I understand why you did it. And I hate that I understand. Welcome to adulthood, Adelheid had said with a sad smile. Where every choice is terrible and you pick the least terrible one and live with the consequences forever. The next morning, Adelheid's seer sight had returned suddenly, violently, with a vision so powerful it had driven her to her knees in the breakfast hall. Ulrich had caught her before she'd hit the floor. Had held her while the vision had torn through her mind with images that made her weep with something between grief and wonder. When it had cleared, when she'd been able to speak again, she'd looked up at her mate with eyes that held impossible knowledge. I saw Caspar, she'd whispered. Adelheid. Not a memory. Not grief hallucination. I saw him. In the future. 20 years from now, there's a wolf born in the Arctic territories with his exact markings. His silver eyes, his gentle strength. And when that wolf is 5 years old, he starts having memories that aren't his own. Memories of being Caspar. Of dying in the capital square. Of choosing sacrifice. Ulrich had gone very still. Reincarnation. That's not, wolves don't. We thought forbidden bloodlines were impossible too. We thought mixing royal lines would create monsters. We thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. She'd gripped his hands tightly. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's truly reincarnation or something else. But I saw it clearly, our son comes back. Not in time to spare us the grief of losing him. Not in time to prevent the pain we're living through now. But eventually, in a world made safer by his sacrifice, he gets another chance. The vision had given Adelheid something she hadn't had in months. Hope. Not the kind that erases grief, but the kind that makes grief bearable. The knowledge that death wasn't the end, that sacrifice wasn't wasted, that the story continued even when individual chapters ended. She'd returned to her duties with renewed purpose. She'd begun teaching Greta and Werner about seer sight. Both children had inherited traces of the gift, though neither had the power she possessed. She'd helped Ulrich navigate the political complexities of a kingdom still adjusting to seismic change. And she'd begun documenting everything. Every vision, every decision, every consequence of the choices they'd made. She was writing a history that future generations could learn from, a guide that said, "This is what happens when you choose differently. This is the cost of reform. This is what sacrifice looks like when it's real and not romanticized." She called it The Forbidden Chronicles, and it would become required reading in the United Territories for the next century. 10 years after Caspar's death, the United Territories had become something even Adelheid's visions hadn't fully anticipated. A genuine democracy. Ulrich had voluntarily reduced the Alpha King's power, had created elected councils that represented all wolves equally, had transformed the throne from absolute authority into something closer to a guiding force that wolves could choose to follow or peacefully disagree with. It was messy, complicated, and occasionally frustrating, but it was also real in a way that the old kingdoms had never been. Greta had become the chief healer at 21, the youngest wolf ever to hold the position. She'd specialized in treating trauma, both physical and psychological, and had developed techniques for helping wolves recover from the kind of grief that came from watching loved ones die for causes larger than themselves. Werner had become something unexpected. A diplomat. He'd taken his anger at systems that demanded sacrifice and channeled it into negotiating with other kingdoms, convincing them to adopt reforms without requiring martyrs. He was fierce, uncompromising, and eerily effective at making Alpha Kings uncomfortable enough to change. And Adelheid had continued seeing visions, though she'd learned to share them more carefully. She'd learned that not every future needed to be prevented, that sometimes seeing disaster coming was enough to help people prepare, that the gift of prophecy was really the gift of informed choice. On the 20th anniversary of Casper's death, during a memorial ceremony where thousands of wolves gathered to honor the heir who'd saved them, a stranger had appeared at the territory border. A young wolf, barely 5 years old, with silver eyes and markings that made every guard who saw him stop and stare. He'd been traveling with his Arctic pack, refugees from a new crisis in the north, and he'd insisted on coming to the capital for reasons he couldn't quite explain. His name was Jacob, and he had Casper's smile. Adelheid had known the moment she'd seen him. Not from resemblance alone. Plenty of wolves had silver eyes, and markings could be coincidental. But from the way he'd looked at her, with recognition that a 5-year-old meeting a stranger shouldn't possess. "You're the seer lady," he'd said quietly, while his parents had been distracted checking in with border guards. "You're the one who saw everything but couldn't stop it." Her breath had caught. "How do you know that?" "I dream about a life that wasn't mine. About dying to save people. About parents who loved me enough to let me go." Those silver eyes had held understanding beyond his years. "The dreams say I should find you. That you'd know what they mean." Adelheid had knelt before this child who might be her son returned, who might be a stranger with inherited memories, who might be something entirely new that the kingdom's emergence had made possible. She'd looked into those familiar eyes and had made a choice. "Would you like to hear a story?" she'd asked gently. Jacob had nodded. So she'd told him. Not the sanitized version that children learned in schools, but the real story. About an Omega who'd run for 3 years. About a rogue Alpha who'd protected from shadows. About a child who'd been declared forbidden and had spent his whole life proving that love was stronger than law. Jacob had listened with the intensity of someone hearing their own history, and when she'd finished, he'd asked the question that would define the next chapter of their lives. Did it work? Did his sacrifice make things better? Adelheid had gestured to the memorial gathering, to thousands of wolves from dozens of bloodlines all standing together in peace. "What do you think?" "I think he'd be happy." Jacob had smiled that heartbreaking smile. "I think he'd say it was worth it." He did say that. Right before. She'd had to stop, swallow grief that 20 years hadn't diminished. Jacob had taken her hand with the unself-conscious comfort of a child. "It's okay to still be sad. The dreams say that sacrifice means someone has to carry the pain. That's how you know it mattered." Jacob's family had settled in the United Territories, had integrated into the community that Casper had died protecting. And over the following years, as Jacob had grown, the question of whether he was truly Casper reborn or simply a wolf with inherited memories had become less important than what he chose to do with either identity. He'd become a healer like his sister Greta, but he'd specialized in something unique, helping wolves who carried the weight of impossible choices. He'd worked with parents who'd had to send children away for safety. He'd counseled survivors of old laws who struggled with guilt for living when others had died. He'd built a practice based on the understanding that sometimes the hardest part of sacrifice wasn't the dying, it was living with the consequences. And he'd called Adelheid aunt, not mother, because while the memories suggested connection, the reality was that she'd already raised her son and buried him and couldn't go through that particular joy and agony again. But she'd loved Jacob fiercely anyway, as you love second chances even when they come in unexpected forms. On her 60th birthday, 30 years after hiding Casper in a burning barn, Adelheid had one final grand vision. The seer sight that had defined her life, that had guided kingdoms and cost her a son and shown her futures both terrible and beautiful, had opened completely one last time. She'd seen the United Territories a century hence, not just surviving but thriving, spread across territories that had once been enemies, governed by councils elected by wolves who'd never known what it meant to have forbidden bloodlines. She'd seen wolves of every combination of heritage leading healing missions, diplomatic efforts, exploration into territories too harsh for single-pack survival. She'd seen a world where the phrase "forbidden bloodline" was taught in history lessons with the same uncomfortable distance that wolves viewed ancient practices of challenging alpha dominance through death matches. Something that had once seemed necessary and right, revealed as cruelty by the perspective of time. And she'd seen herself, old and tired and satisfied, surrounded by children and grandchildren and descendants of the wolves she'd saved, telling stories about the day everything changed because one Omega refused to accept that her son was disposable. The vision had faded gently this time, not the violent withdrawal she'd experienced in youth, and when she'd opened her eyes, she'd found Ulrich beside her, silver threading through his dark hair, his face lined with years of leadership and love. "What did you see?" he'd asked, as he'd asked 1,000 times over 3 decades. "The ending," she'd said simply. "And it's good." But that wasn't quite true. Because as the vision had faded, as Adelheid had been returning to present consciousness, she'd caught a glimpse of something else. A shadow on the horizon. A threat she couldn't quite identify, coming not in her lifetime but in her grandchildren's. She'd seen Greta's daughter 40 years hence, standing in a burning building making the same impossible choice Adelheid had made. Run or sacrifice. Hide or stand. Save one life or save thousands. She'd seen the cycle beginning again, because apparently the universe believed that some lessons had to be relearned by every generation, that peace was always one crisis away from shattering, that the price of choosing differently was eternal vigilance and occasional sacrifice. She'd seen Werner's son leading an army against a threat she couldn't name, carrying a weapon she didn't recognize, fighting a war that made the old bloodline conflicts look like children's disputes. And she'd seen Jacob, whether he was Caspar returned or simply carried his memories, standing at a crossroads that would determine whether the United Territories survived its 2nd century or collapsed back into the cycles of fear and separation that had defined the first 300 years. The vision had ended there, frustratingly incomplete, maddeningly ambiguous. Adelheid had not shared this final vision. Not with Ulrich, not with her children, not with the Healers' Guild that documented her prophecies. Because some visions weren't warnings to be heeded. They were simply confirmation that the work was never done, that every generation would face their own burning barns, their own impossible choices, their own moments of deciding what they loved more than their own comfort. She'd lived 60 years. She'd seen her mate declared dead and watched him return. She'd run for 3 years and ruled for 30. She'd lost her son and found him again in different form. She'd changed kingdoms and been changed by them. And as she sat in her garden on her 60th birthday, surrounded by roses and grandchildren and wolves who owed their freedom to the fact that one Omega had hidden a forbidden bloodline in a burning barn and given him the chance to choose his own fate, she'd felt something she'd rarely experienced in all her years of seeing the future. Peace with the present. The threats would come. The choices would be impossible. The sacrifices would be required. But tonight, in this moment, surrounded by the family she'd fought for and the kingdom she'd helped build, Adelheid Brunner von Gotthard was simply a grandmother telling stories to children who would face their own fire soon enough. And that was enough. Because in the end, this was never a story about forbidden bloodlines or royal decrees or alpha kings who learned to choose differently. It was a story about a mother who loved her child more than her own life but loved him well enough to let him choose his own death. It was about a father who'd spent 3 years as a shadow and 30 years as a king and learned that both roles required the same skill: protecting without controlling, guiding without commanding, loving without possessing. It was about a child who'd been declared impossible and had proven that impossible just meant no one had been brave enough to try. And it was about the moment, that single burning moment in a barn 20 years ago, when one Omega had looked at the flames and the hunters and her hidden son and had decided that some things were worth any sacrifice, any pain, any consequence. The rogue watching had been his father. But the true protector, the real guardian, the wolf who'd saved not just one child but an entire kingdom's capacity to choose mercy over fear, that had always been Adelheid. And her story, like all the best stories, didn't end with happily ever after. It ended with the promise that the next generation would face their own fires and make their own choices and write their own chapters in the Chronicle of Wolves who learned,